First of all, hopefully you're here for themes and texts of the Penitential season. If not, you have entered the wrong Zoom room. But we are going to ask everybody to mute themselves with a crowd this large. And what we will be doing is asking if you have questions during Rabbi's presentation for you to type them into the chat. And he, off camera, you can't see to his, I guess be to his right, is Aaron Walter of the Walter family fame, who will be providing Rabbi Walter with those questions. There he is. And he will be answering those questions. So again, because of the size, we're just going to ask everybody to keep themselves muted, which will make the class go, much more smoothly and a much more comfortable presentation on the computer. And with that, I'm going to actually mute myself and turn off my camera and turn it over to Rabbi Walter.
Okay, thanks, David. I appreciate it. Just one thing, if you'll notice, it should be at the bottom of your screen something that says chat. If you want to ask a question, since there are so many of us, if you click on that, I see a 1 down there, Aaron. Does that mean there's a,
yep, that's because it says please type your questions in the chat when you have them.
Okay.
That's the message.
All right, so just click on that and you can write in a question or make a comment about the text. So I'm going to begin. First of all, let me tell you what we're doing. Since at the time they asked me to do this, I had not yet had a chance to figure out exactly what I wanted to do. And then they proceeded without calling me. And so anyhow, I think you'll enjoy what we're going to do. On a normal Yom Kippur afternoon, in the afternoon service, you'll recall that the Torah portion is Leviticus 19, which begins with that famous statement, and the Lord spoke to Moses and all the people of Israel, saying, speak to all the congregation of Israel and say, holy shall you be. Remember, for I, the Lord your God, am holy. I'm sure you all remember that's one of the most famous lines truly in all of Torah. And since we're not going to have an afternoon service, it appears, I thought it would be especially poignant, even if we were going to have one, to spend some time talking about what does holy shall you be for or as. Translation, those of you who study with me know that translation is interpretation when it comes to any text. You can't really translate something without allowing a certain amount of interpretation. I'm giving you a brief example of it from this this portion. It happens that my Torah portion for the sermon that I gave at the Hebrew Union College my senior year happened to be this text. And I based my whole sermon on the translation, not holy shall you be for, meaning because I, the Lord your God, am holy, but rather I translated as I, the Lord your God, am holy. And I did my whole sermon just based on the fact that of the change in translation. So that's just a little bitty example of it. The major example of that, which has nothing to do with our text, is I know you are familiar with the translation of the Hebrew scriptures in the New Testament versions, where this is considered the Old Testament. It says, behold, a virgin shall conceive and bear a child, and they shall call his name Emmanuel. And the word virgin, of course, is what gives rise to the whole concept of the virgin birth in Christianity. Well, actually, that's not the correct translation. What happened was the Hebrew word is not virgin, but young woman or maiden. If you translate that into Greek, the word that they translated to has two meanings. It means both young woman and virgin. And when they translated from the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation, into the Latin translation, which is the Vulgate, they chose the latter meaning of the Greek word, and that's how we get to virgin in the Christian translations of the New Testament. Okay, so my point is not to give a lecture on that, but just to point out that anytime you see something translated, it means that the person translating it has had to make a decision, because especially in a language like Hebrew, where it's old and it's a very small vocabulary compared to the number of words we have in, say, English, one word could be easily translated, or even one letter can be translated many, many, many different ways. And the way you translate it could have an implication on how you what you think the text actually means. So before we begin, there's a blessing that we recite over studying Torah. Some of you I see on this on the website already know it. If not, we're going to go nice and slow. So if you'll follow after me, we're going to make the blessing for studying Torah. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav b'tzivanu. Okay, and then la'asok. Okay, that is, blessed are you, O Lord of God, ruler of the universe, who has sanctified us with your commandments, commanding us to engage ourselves in the study of Torah. So, David, who's putting the text up?
Nathan has that for you.
So Nathan, would you put up page 1?
We have a question.
Yes.
Is that, hold on a second, it popped out. Is that the origin of the phrase lost in translation? That
No,
is
it
from
actually-
Eugene.
No, it's actually not. Lost in translation comes from the mind of some person who wrote the book or the movie. It has no connection that I know of to biblical criticism. Okay, so notice at the top, I put the text of what we're actually studying. And the Lord spoke to Moses and say to them, meaning to the people, speak to all the congregation of the children of Israel, saying, holy shall you be. And I've translated this for I, the Lord your God, am holy, which is the traditional way the rabbis understand it, not the way I preached my sermon on it. But I wanted to stick with this because we're going to be looking at some traditional commentaries. Now, I put some notes up before we get to the actual commentators that are important. This turns out this is going to be a little bit of an X-rated Torah study. I did not plan that. It just so happens that it is. And hadn't looked at these commentaries in so long, I had forgotten it. So look at my note number 1. Leviticus 19 sits between 18 and 20, between 2 chapters that list in great detail many of the sins of a sexual nature. I will not trouble you with what they are. Thus, the rabbis see the opening verses of chapter 19 as part of the flow of those sins, which guides many of their commentaries. And you will see that immediately when we get to Rashi. It jumps out at you. The second thing that I want all of you to know is that when we read chapter 19 in Reformed synagogues, we actually read an abbreviated version of it. There are sections consisting of particularly ritual and some of those other sexual laws that Reformed Jews eliminate from reading on afternoon. For the rabbis, meaning the traditional rabbis, while there is a recognition that ritual and moral sins are in separate categories, nonetheless, pardon the typo, they are equal in their force, and holiness is dependent on them both. In other words, we look at the moral laws that are in this chapter. We pull out the ritual ones because we don't look at them in the same way. But what I want you to realize is that while the traditional rabbis recognize that there is a difference between moral and ritual laws, we are equally bound by all of them. And that's why the rabbis have in the reading in a traditional synagogue all of the verses. Finally, I'm adding this in because I want you to know this, and it's important to me at least that you not be restricted in what you think the rabbinic view of sex is based on these verses. These verses are talking about what they consider to be sexual immorality, not sex between two people who love each other in a marital relationship. So I just want to say, while the rabbis in their commentaries focus on sex in restrictive terms for procreation only, even in marriage, because of the chapters that surround it, there are many other places in rabbinic literature where they write quite liberally and descriptively on the beauty of sex and encourage what they call ongei haguf, the pleasures of the body. So I don't want you to think that just because we are looking at a series of texts that are restrictive, that there's not a different view of sex in Judaism, which is really quite contemporary if you think about it. See that Ed Hauser has entered the waiting room. Okay, so Rashi is the earliest of the main commentators. You see the years of his life are from 1040 to 1105. And here you see exactly what I was talking about. That thing about the waiting room is somehow, okay, thank you. The phrase, all the congregation, notice it doesn't say speak to the congregation, it says speak to all the congregation. And you can imagine that that would be a lot of, a good bouncing off place for rabbis to say. In other places, it only says speak to the congregation. This says speak to all the congregation. And so he says, why does it say all? The phrase teaches that this section was stated in an assembly. In other words, it wasn't something that Moses taught from once in a while. He gathered all of the people together and gave these verses. Why? Because the majority of all the essentials of Torah are dependent on you shall be holy. Okay? Now, he goes on to talk specifically about incest and the other transgressions that you find, and etc. But the part that I want to concentrate on is because the majority of the essentials of Torah depend on holy shall you be, for I, the Lord your God, am holy. Okay? So Rashi's point, I think, is that if you look at this, and this point is made later on, I don't think I actually put it in here. There's a point later on where he says, this chapter is so similar to the 10 Commandments that he sees a connection between the two of them. Okay, would you go to page 2, please? Okay. Oops, where did we go? Now I can't see that. Okay. Now, Rashbam is another commentator who lived a little after Rashi. And look what he says, be holy. What does that mean? Because most of the commandments are designed to sanctify you and to be observed by you. So what is he saying? He's saying that what does it mean to be holy? We sanctify ourselves by observing the commandments. So holy shall you be means observe the commandments. How do you sanctify yourselves? How do you live a holy life? You live a holy life by observing the commandments of Judaism. Now, there are going to be some commentaries that we read further on that are going to be revealing a little more detail about all that. Okay, I see things in the chat. Are there things?
Nope.
Okay, all right. So then we look at Lahmanidis. Now, Lahmanidis is an interesting commentator. A lot of his commentaries are very mystical in nature, okay? So let's see what he has to say, okay? Our rabbis have already said that this section was addressed to the full assembly. Why? Because most of the fundamental principles of the Torah are dependent on it and thus speak to all the congregation. Why is it mentioned in Leviticus? In other words, Leviticus, remember the word Levi is where Leviticus comes from. It's really a book for the priests. Why? Because the previous chapter speaks of punishment for abominable deeds. So Nachmanides goes back to what I was talking about earlier. He sees this in the context of the chapter that came before it and the chapter that came after it. And he feels as though it specifically is referring to any of the abominable, particularly sexual deeds, although there were some others mentioned. And one of the things that I learned from my biblical studies class with Dr. Rifkin, who was one of the most amazing Bible teachers I've ever had, one of the things that he reminds us is when you find a prohibition, in the Bible, especially when you see a prohibition that is emphasized, you have to say to yourself, well, why are they emphasizing it? Is it because it wasn't happening, or is it more likely because it was happening? And so if you look at these commentaries through the eyes of that biblical, of my teacher, what he's saying, the real reason these things are in the Bible is because the Bible is against it because it was going on, okay? So then you go on and he says, wherever you find in the Torah a warning to guard against immorality, then you find the mention of holiness. So the brackets is Roy Walter, not his commentary. I'm assuming that what he's saying is that guarding against immorality is how you describe, is what holiness means. And then he goes back and refers to Rashi and says, basically what it means is self-restraint. And if you think about the laws against sexual immorality or against breaking any commandment, what it's about is self-restraint, almost like discipline. And so I want to use this as an opportunity to make the following observation, going back to Rashi, but emphasizing it here. And that is that the Torah recognizes that the commandments, and the rabbis feel the same way, the commandments that we are supposed to observe, both the positive ones and the negative ones, the commandments are the way in which we achieve sanctification, the way in which we live holy lives, okay? And then I want you to skip down just a little bit to the sentence that begins, since the Torah. Can you see that? It's right after the parenthesis, all right? Since the Torah does allow certain urges, okay, and then it goes on to describe what they are, then go down to after the ... Scripture's main intention is to warn us to be physically clean and ritually pure, separated from others who soil themselves with luxuries and unseemly things, okay? So in other words, there are the things that we are allowed, our urges we are allowed, but we do them in a disciplined fashion. That's what the commandments, the mitzvot, are all about. So for example, eating is an urge, but you don't eat like an animal. You don't just stuff your mouth. And there are certain things that you do eat and certain things that you don't eat. And when you sit down to eat, you make a blessing. So what the rabbis are saying is, it's not that we're forbidden to be human beings. We're forbidden to use our bodies and respond to our urges. It's that the commandments help us to do so in a manner that gives us self-control, and we use them, we exercise them in the right way. Okay, so I'd like to now look at Bahya ben Asher. Does anybody have a question about Bahya? Okay, Bahya, as you see, lived a little bit later. He doesn't live until the 13th century. And now we begin to get a little bit of an intellectual look at human behavior. Look what this says. When we look at the creatures created on the sixth day of creation, by the way, we were created on the same day as the animals that have four legs, creatures, okay? When we look at all the creatures created on the sixth day, we find that the creatures created prior to man can be divided into two groups. One is abstract intelligences. He's going to tell you what that means in a second. And the second is creatures bound to the earth by their bodies. Who is the first group? The angels. Creatures which are totally disembodied and divorced from anything material. The second group, trees, vegetation, all the living creatures of manner, they are devoid of intelligence. Both groups are not free agents, but have to obey, sorry about the typo, the instructions received from their creator. So what is he saying? By intelligence, what does he mean? By intelligence in the sense of not abstract intelligence, but intelligence on earth, what he's talking about basically is free will. And one of the things that is interesting that a lot of people don't stop to think about is that from the rabbinic and the biblical point of view, angels or heavenly bodies or hosts, it's hard to translate the word into English, but let's use angels for the moment. They don't have free will. They have to do what God says. Animals don't have free will. They simply follow their instincts. Human beings are the marriage of heaven and earth in the sense that we have intelligence and we have bodies. And so by using our free will, we have the ability, which angels don't even have, we have the ability to decide what we're going to do. God says you should do this. We have the free will not to do that. Angels don't have that power, okay? So look down in the next paragraph, the halfway down, it says the principal difference. The principal difference between man and other creatures is that human beings possess willpower. That is, decisions that we make are free will, not feel will. Sorry about that. If human beings are circumspect, we can successfully overcome our natural urges, the same ones we have in common with other animals. But if we fail to resist from that, then we neglect the influence of our intelligence, which is the thing that makes us closer to the angels. And so the body is the home of the baser instincts of man. What we have is the intelligence, okay? And by intelligence here, what the rabbis really mean is free will, a different kind of intelligence even than the angels. The angels have to do what God says. We have a choice. So the angels, because they cannot choose, the angels are holy by nature. When we choose, when we use our free will to live by the mitzvot, to live our lives in a proper way, that's when we have the opportunity to live holy lives and to follow the commandment, "You shall be holy." Would you go to the next 2 pages, please? Page 4. Okay. So now we're going to look at Jacob ben Asher, known as the Baal HaTurim. He lived a little bit later. He's now going to talk about what it's like to live in the material world, and he does so in a very interesting way. I love this first paragraph especially. A person should train himself to be moderate in enjoying the material attractions the world has to offer. Now, notice he's not saying you should not enjoy the material attractions. He says moderate, and that really becomes the whole key to the way he looks at being holy and mitzvah. They may be enjoyed when they are intended to make the performance of a commandment more meaningful, both aesthetically and artistically. And this is beautiful. For instance, a person intent on attaining a level of holiness would not seek out material attractions just for their own sake. And then the following example. When someone loves silver trinkets and collects them, this does not further his path to attaining holiness, though he did not do anything forbidden. If, however, he were to indulge that whim by buying beautiful etrog boxes or mezuzah housings or kiddush cups, then he may be at one and the same time able to indulge his sense of what is aesthetic beautiful and come closer to attaining a degree of holiness. So once again, is there a way to marry the material attractions of the world to our spiritual lives? And that's what he's giving you an example of. To just collect beautiful things because they're beautiful things, it's not that you can't do that. The question is, what does that really add to your life in terms of kadosh, in terms of holiness? And so he then goes on and explains, God does not expect that we, his creatures, can become like him, the creator. In other words, God knows That's why I didn't like the translation, you shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy. That was what my speech was about. We can't be holy the way God is. But God hopes and God expects that we will try to emulate as many of God's characteristics as it is possible for us to do so, taking in mind that we are only creatures. We cannot be God. We cannot achieve 100% holiness. But by doing what we can, emulating to the best of our ability what we think God represents, then we achieve a measure of close attachment to the divine. Now, notice what he's saying. We don't achieve the divine. We achieve an attachment to the divine. He's saying we can't ever fully get there. We can't become divine the way God is divine, but we can attach ourselves as closely as possible by doing what? By observing the mitzvot, by following the 613 commandments, okay? Now, remember, when we as Reformed Jews look at this, and again, the best way to know that I'm not just making this up is to look at what parts of the chapter that a Reformed synagogue reads on Yom Kippur afternoon. It includes all of the moral things, but leaves out all of those ritual things. For Reformed Jews, we have a choice to make, okay? An Orthodox Jew, and this is one of the things that I remember from growing up as you know, I grew up in an Orthodox congregation. All of the mitzvot have, in one sense, an equal value. Now, that doesn't mean some aren't more important than others, but they're all commandments. Remember what the word commandment means. The mitzvah means commandment. And a commandment is not something you should be choosing to do or not do because you have free will. You do have the choice. But the concept of mitzvah is, I do this because I am commanded to do it. And so whether it's not stealing or it's lighting Shabbat candles, whether it's not killing somebody or it's observing the laws of kashrut, these are all commandments. One of the things I think you would all agree that Reformed Judaism has sort of come along and done is to take the ritual commandments and put them sort of to the side and to say, we find the moral mitzvot to be obligatory, but the ritual mitzvot in Reformed Judaism, I think if you just look at the way, not just you, but most Reformed Jews and even not even Reformed, the way most modern Jews live their lives, unless they're Orthodox, is that we choose certain rituals and we don't choose other rituals. I think that's a good description of how most of us live our lives. I think we would all agree that God is more concerned with whether you behaved in a moral way than he is whether you lit Shabbos candles or observed kashrut. That's for each Jew to decide for him or herself in the way Reform looks at it, but we don't get to decide what a moral law is. Now, of course, we get caught in all kinds of moral dilemmas. Is this the right way? Is that the right way? But the point here is that in order for us to attempt to achieve holiness, our goal is not to be God. Our goal is to attach ourselves to the divine by the way in which we live and observe the mitzvot. So that's as holy, so to speak, as we can possibly be. Okay, so I want to now look at Sephorno, who is the next commentator. I want to go to the second paragraph. As what I did, which is my usual flaw, is I put in a whole lot more than I knew that I was going to be able to get to. But you know, that's the way I teach. I can't help it. I'd rather have more to choose from than less to choose from. So let me look at. I want to look at the. I've done some underlining on mine. Okay, so I want to look at Sephorno, and I want to look at the second paragraph. Okay. The first part is on some of the rituals. Paragraph 2, God had elaborated on other ritual contaminations contracted through sexual contact. Why? The objective of those parts of Torah is to establish a nation that will be described as holy, not the least of it, the legislation concerning incest. At this point, that is, after achieving holiness, emulating God's holiness, Torah spells out the objective by saying, I, the Lord your God, am holy. Okay? The last sentence, Torah now proceeds to list laws which appeared on the first of the two tablets, whose objective it is to ensure enduring life for the Jewish people. So here's where we get the connection between the Ten Commandments and the Holiness Code that we are looking at here. Notice he says the first two tablets, okay? The second two tablets are the ones that contain you shall not kill, you shall not commit adultery, all of the ones that we would classify in the moral section. Notice what he's doing. He's connecting it more to the first two. I'm the Lord your God, you shall have no other gods before me, you shall not bow down to others, all of which is the Bible's way of saying, don't behave like other people. This is how you are supposed to behave. And what is the force? This is the important thing that I think he's trying to get at. For I, the Lord your God, am holy. The force behind all of this is that however other people live, this is how you are supposed to live. Don't base your behavior on what you see going on in the world around you. Base your behavior on these commandments, on these stipulations as to the things that you are and are not supposed to do, the way in which you are and are not supposed to live. What is the force of that? The force of that goes back to I, the Lord your God, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. Okay, and what is the reference here? Holy shall you be. Why? Because, or as, or however you want to translate it, I, the Lord your God, am holy. Don't follow what other people do. Don't live your lives based on what other people do. Follow the commandments because I am your God, and you are to achieve as close an attachment to me as you can by behaving in the way in which I have stipulated. So here again, these rabbis they continue to, what's the word I want? They continue to re-emphasize, for lack of a better word, they continue to re-emphasize the importance of the connection between our behavior and God, who is the source of the commandments of how we are supposed to behave.
So we have a question from Stephen Reiner.
Yes.
If so, why? There's one rabbi who was more thought of than another. I'm not sure I understand the question. Stephen, could you
repeat it to me?
It says is, and if so, why? Stephen, if you could retype, it looks like I'm missing something in the...
If you're, let me answer the second question that I think I do understand, which is one rabbi more respected. Is that the word?
Could be. It says more thought of.
More thought of. Well, let me say this. First of all, I'm going to give you an answer within the Orthodox concept, not the Reform. Okay. In the Reform concept, first of all, no Orthodox Jew reads the Torah without Rashi. The first one that we read. Rashi sets the base. He was the first one to really write a commentary going verse by verse by verse through the Torah. He probably knew the rabbinic literature that preceded him, the Talmud and the Midrash. He probably basically knew it by heart and had complete, full, and total recall. And so he is sort of like the foundation of interpretation for the rabbis. Now, as to these rabbis that I am now quoting, the ones whose commentaries we also have before us, these commentators come along and they go through the same process that Rashi did, but you'll notice that one of the things that I have done here is that I have listed them chronologically. And I did that for a reason, because first of all, each commentator that follows has read the commentaries of the rabbi before him. So when you look, for example, at Sepharno, whose commentary we just looked at, Sepharno has read the commentaries of all the rabbis who come before him. So when he goes to make his commentary, he has already read, all the commentaries that came before him, and then he will repeat some of what he says, but then he will bring his thoughts to it. Is one of them more important or more authoritative than the other? Not really. Again, we start with Rashi, but I think the answer is that remember that for the rabbis, when they use the word Torah, they don't just mean the 5 books of Moses. For the rabbis, Torah means all of rabbinic Judaism, all the writings, the text of the Bible, the Mishnah, the Midrash, the Gemara, the Talmud, all these writings. This is all Torah, and so it's all there for us to sort of look at. Some of these rabbis are considered more authoritative by other rabbis because they feel like their commentaries are more insightful. But that doesn't mean that if you find an insight in one of the others, they're not just as valid. That wouldn't be true. The fact is that they all have validity. You get to read through them all. Okay, so let's go to page 7, please. Okay, I want to look at just part of this. Hold on just a second. This is from Sepharno, who lived in the 14 to 1500s. And I want to start on the right-hand side, the reason the text says, about halfway down. Notice, if you look back at the original verse, it says, speak to the children of Israel, saying. The word speak and say are both there. Sometimes the text does that, sometimes it does not. So let's look at the commentary that he has on that. The reason that the text says God spoke and said is that this portion contains so much basic legislation that God wanted it presented in a manner similar to the revelation at Sinai, where both words are used. Okay, now here's something, for example, to go back to the question that was asked. Notice that Rashi missed this point, but this commentator sees it. So this is an interesting insight. Rashi talks about the connection with the 10 Commandments, but look what this commentator does. He says, in the case of the 10 Commandments, it says, and the Lord spoke all these words saying, he says, spoke and say, and this text turns around and does exactly the same thing. And that's another reason to connect all the ideas and all the commandments that are in here with the 10 Commandments, okay? He finds an actual textual connection. We read on. We need to analyze what precisely God meant when he commanded us to either be or become holy. Let me just pause and say, here you see where translation is commentary, okay? Holy shall you be, or holy shall you become. We have 2 words in English. Hebrew does not. Both are legitimate translations, okay? So either be or become. Look what he says. I believe Torah wanted to add a positive commandment as a corollary to the string of negative commandments that we've just read. Look what he's saying. We just read all those negative commandments. Don't do this, don't do this, don't do this, don't do that. I need something positive. He says a person guilty of violating the negative, also violates now a positive commandment to strive to be holy. So there's a double whammy in a sense. It's not only that you're supposed to avoid doing this, it's that you're supposed to go the other way. It's not just what you're not supposed to do, it's what you are supposed to do. We learn in Talmud Kiddushin that if a person sits quietly and refrains from committing a transgression, he's given a reward as if he had performed a positive commandment, which is the meaning of the verse. In other words, not doing something negative is a positive. So when you restrain yourself, when you withhold yourself, which is what free will is all about, then you have made a positive step. To read on, God commanded the entire people to be holy, to show them how easy it is to be counted among those described as holy. In other words, it doesn't have to be hard. Remember what it says in the morning for the commandment, it's not over the sea that you have to, somebody has to go get it for you. It's not on top of a mountain, somebody has to climb. It's right here, remember the morning. It's in your mouth, it's in your heart. You know what to do. I'm reading, every single individual can achieve a spiritual level simply by fighting off the desire to violate a commandment when opportunity presents itself. Not doing something that you're not supposed to do is a positive. That's one of the ways in which you can become holy. Okay? So if you go to page 8. Okay? And I want to read not the first paragraph, but the second paragraph. You shall be holy then is not written in the past tense, not written in the present tense, but is written in the future tense. I love this. The implication then is what? This is a commandment, which is an ongoing process. The commandment applies day in and day out throughout our lifetime. God desires that his favorite creatures engage in an ongoing process of becoming more and more like their Father in heaven. Now, we could do a whole class just on this, but I want to take a couple of minutes and really look at this as I think perhaps the most important reason we would read this on a day like Yom Kippur. What he's saying is that this is a process. Following this commandment, becoming holy is holiness is not something you are. Holiness is something that is a process. It's ongoing. It's nothing you can ever fully achieve in any one given moment, because the next moment is filled with it just as many opportunities as the previous moment not to live a holy life. So it's an ongoing process. It's a choice we make every single day of our lives. And I think that's sort of what the real message of Yom Kippur is, isn't it? That we are here to atone for our sins. But remember, it's not good enough to say, I'm sorry. You have to do two things. First of all, if you hurt me, you have to apologize to me. If I hurt you, I have to apologize to you. But what's the second step in repentance? The second step is changing your behavior. If you keep doing the same thing over and over and over again, then you're not moving forward. Attaining holiness, to whatever degree we can, attaining holiness is accomplished by an ongoing process, day in, day out of living. So the implication of you shall be holy, he says, is it's not you shall be holy, you shall become holy. Every moment is filled with the potential for you to make the right decision, to make the right choice, to do the right thing. And that's I think, maybe the most important insight to me in this text. It is that you're never going to achieve it completely. You have, every time you make a decision, every time you do something, that moment is filled with the possibility of either being holy or not being holy. And I can't imagine that there's a single person that's on this Zoom that could not account in his or her own life opportunities where you make a decision and it's the right decision, and then you turn around and the next thing you know, you're faced with another decision and you're going to make the right decision or the wrong decision. Living is an ongoing process, and therefore becoming holy, being holy, whatever that means, is also an ongoing process. So now I want to look at Samson Raphael Hirsch. We have lots of time left, but I sort of, if you'll notice, I sort of bolded parts of it. So I want to read the first paragraph, and then I want to jump down to the part that's bolded. Regarding these laws of sexual modesty, and here I think this, remember, he's a 19th century commentator, so you're going to get a very modern look at things. I love this line. No institution of the power of the state can really achieve them. You can make all the laws you want, okay? Crimes against them are beyond the reach of any human court of the just. Mastery of them is partly dependent on the character of the persons concerned. What an amazing, important insight. There's a difference between a mitzvah and a law, in the sense that the law says you have to do this or you cannot do that. But because you have free will, you can break the law, okay? You master the powers within you, not because the law says you should or shouldn't do it. You do it because it's your choice, okay? Mastery of them is dependent on the character of the persons concerned. The law can say that you're not supposed to do this, but you decide whether you're going to do it. So character, which is, as many of you know, is probably one of my favorite words in the English language when it comes to describing a good person. Character is where it is. The willingness to make the right choices. So now I want to go down to the highlighted portion. We have about, 10 minutes left, something like that?
Oh.
Okay. So actually, let's start at the beginning of the paragraph, because I think it's worth it. Holiness, and the reason it's in italics is because kadosh is what we're talking about. I'm translating. Is the product of the completest mastery by the godlike free-willed human being over all his forces and natural tendencies and the allurements and inclinations associated with them. The mastery of oneself, the highest possible art which human beings can practice, does not consist of neglecting, curtailing, killing, or doing away with one's powers or even one's natural tendencies. No single one of the powers and natural tendencies which are given to man is either good or bad in itself. And that's where we're going to focus in a few minutes. From the most spiritual down to the most sensuous. They are all given to us for beneficial purposes. Torah gives them a positive aim and a negative limit. In the service of this purpose indicated by God and within these limits set by God, everything, underline that in your life, everything is good and holy. In exercising one's power of restraint or self-control, that is to gain mastery over one's inclinations. That is the work we are called to do. Each one of us, according to our own individual peculiarities, work that is done quietly, silently, and known to no one himself. Separating oneself from sin is the first step to holiness. The holiness you are to strive to achieve is accomplished through moral free will, which I gave you with my breath. Going back to Genesis, God breathed into man's nostrils the breath of life. Inasmuch as I am your God, Inasmuch as you call me your God, I call you my people. The holiness of my name in the world is dependent on your manner, your morals, and your way of life. Now, there's something specific that's being implicated here that I need to tell you. And that is, if you remember, the name of the Jewish people in the Bible is Israel. And what does Israel mean? One who struggles with God, going back to Jacob struggling with the angel or whatever it was, okay? So in the very name that we walk around this world with, the people of Israel, El, God's name, is there. And so the concept is that as we behave, so God's reputation is at stake. Because if they say a Jew did this, meaning a person of the people of Israel did it, then it reflects not just on us, it also reflects on God. And that's one of the central rabbinic theses throughout all of rabbinic writing. God's image in the world, out among others, is mirrored by our behavior. And I don't think I have to go any further than to tell all of you to look onto the wall of Temple Emmanuel, where it says, where they have the two statements, do justly, love mercy, walk humbly with God. And God tells us to be what? A holy nation, okay? You shall be holy. Be a light unto the nations. That's what that means. We are a light to the nations because as we behave, so God's reputation is reflected in the world. We are the reflectors of God's light by our behavior. That's what that concept is about. But I want to go back now to earlier in that paragraph, okay? No single power or tendency is good or bad in itself. They are all given to us, okay? I think there's a different way of looking at the world than the Christian world around us looks at the world. What is sin in Judaism? It's a simple concept. It's missing the mark. The word for sin, chata, means to, it's an arrow's, an archer's term, means to miss the mark, okay? There is nothing on this earth that is in and of itself evil by nature or good by nature. Good and evil exist in the world in potential. The example I've always liked to use is atomic power. It can blow up a city or it can light a city. There's nothing innately good and there's nothing innately evil in atomic power. It's what we do with it. It's the choices that we make that turn behavior or powers into good or evil. They exist in potential. And so, for example, what he says about all of our human tendencies, natural tendencies, hunger is a natural tendency. Sex is a natural tendency. There's a certain tendency for power within us. All of these can be harnessed and used for good. They are not good or evil in themselves. It's what we do with them that makes them good. And so holy shall you be means here you have the opportunity as human beings with free will to make the choice to use everything that you have and everything that you come in contact with. You have the power to make your life holy by choosing to use that for good and not for ill. And that's essentially what Yom Kippur, I think we would all agree, is all about. So with that, I sort of end my presentation. I hope you found the texts interesting and informative. So if anyone has a question or you'd like to ask or comment, I would certainly love to try and respond to it. Anybody got a question or comment?
So far, the only thing I have is that we're going to make the text available to folks, so we can send an email out after the fact.
Yes, if you want to take a look at these afterwards, there's an email, there's a text here that says that you will be able to get them.
Just have them email you and you can reply.
If you email me, I can get it to you. So that's all it takes. I can get you the text if you'd like it. Okay, thank you all for joining in. I appreciate the time that you have given. Again, I wish you an easy fast and certainly a Gemar Chatima Tova. May you be inscribed in the book of life, not only for life, but for a wonderful year. I think we're all ready to move on past what we've been through. I hope that each and every one of you has a wonderful, wonderful, beautiful new year. Shana Tova, everybody. Healthy, happy, and sweet.
Shana Tova, Rabbi.
Shana Tova, Rabbi.
Shana Tova.
Shana Tova.
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 Bye.
Yeshikoah.
Tova.